Canada and provides the technical support to these webinars, so we're very appreciative of his assistance. I'm John Pattison Williams, and I am the coordinator of the policy committee for the Prairie Habitat Joint Venture. And it's a real pleasure to see all of you here today. And this is a good opportunity for us to hear from Tammy and Christian. So I'll just introduce them briefly. We don't have long relationships. I don't know both of them too, over the years. But Tammy VerCauteren is the executive director of the Bird Conservancy of the Rockies. And I met Tammy last year whilst she was doing some of the presentation and conference for the Central Grasslands Roadmap. And Christian Artuso is going to tag team with Tammy today, and he's a birds biologist with the Canadian Wildlife Service, but he chairs the Canadian working group for this roadmap. So it's a real pleasure to have them here today and present to us, and welcome, and there you go.
Thank you so much, John. Christian and I really appreciate the opportunity to be here. I'm going to turn off my video just to help with bandwidth. And what Christian and I would like to talk about is a collaborative conservation strategy for our central grasslands. And we're looking forward to updating you on our roadmap effort and visiting with you afterwards with your questions. So a lot of you are familiar with joint ventures. So the idea here is, and the point of the roadmap effort is that together we achieve new heights and better and more effective grassland conservation. All of you here today are champions, your levers, your partners, your key players for the future of grasslands. So together we can change the paradigm of our grasslands from declining and degraded to thriving. Our grassland bird populations from some of the species most at risk to stable and long-term sustainability. And our human community.
Your slides are not advancing there. Just,
they're not.
No, we're still seeing the front page. So just if you can maybe tap the screen and then whip through it.
It's showing, it's moving on mine, so I don't know what to do here, Ian. Should I just give control?
This is John here. Why don't you just stop sharing and then try sharing again, Tammy? That quite often works for me.
Okay. I'm not the most technological savvy, so.
Well, there you go. And now if you press and put back to slide. Yeah.
Okay.
I wonder if your arrows work on your screen easier.
It might be the presenter view that's causing an issue if you have it on two screens.
Nope, I'm just on one screen, so I don't know how to advance the slides for you. So Ian, if you want to take it over, I can just tell you to advance.
Sure, just a second. You're going to have to stop sharing your screen and I'll go ahead and bring up the presentation.
This is why those backups are so good.
Yeah.
Don't worry at all.
Okay, so you're on the same as me. Okay, great. Sorry, folks, for the disruption, but you get the gist that together we can do it better, that we can change the trajectory of bird populations, get them to stable. We can also address the challenges that our human communities are facing, from running out of water to dealing with climate change, and helping ensure our landscapes are healthy and resilient so people are making a living and also thriving. Next slide. This has been a diverse planning committee that's come together for the roadmap effort. We've been in process for about 18 months, and there's more than 30 partners representing 8 sectors that live and work in the Central Grasslands. This includes non-government, state, federal, academia, indigenous, industry, foundations, and private landowners, and also 3 countries of Canada, the US, and Mexico. We also have the Joint Venture 8 Representative Graham on our committee, as well as 2 joint venture coordinators with the Northern Great Plains and Oaks and Prairies. Next slide. So this is meant to be a shared model. We're working under a constellation. We have this steering committee, this planning committee that's moving the roadmap forward. And Bird Conservancy is just serving as a convening organization, trying to help catalyze the efforts and keep us headed in the same direction. And we have a professional facilitator that continues to create tools and ways to address gaps and needs and keep us moving forward. And as you can see here, different folks are stepping up and leading in different areas. We have these work groups that connect back to the shared vision, objectives in the roadmap, and they focus on more relevant priorities in the roadmap. So the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation is helping lead a foundations group. The federal agencies, Fish and Wildlife Service and Forest Service, are trying to help get more collaboration and coordination across federal agencies. World Wildlife Fund is helping with private industry. You also have Audubon Rockies helping lead a policy group. And these working groups are diverse, including landowners to policy to foundations, and again, multiple people helping lead this effort. Next slide. This just gives you a sense of the different folks who've come to the table to help make the roadmap effort possible, from states to industry to foundations and non-governmental organizations. We'll also be pursuing additional sponsors as we work towards our in-person summit in May of 2022. Next slide. So this kicked off basically in 2020, and we did a survey in the spring and really wanted to gather what are the feelings, what do people see when they think of the grasslands for the future? And that really helped lay the foundation for the meeting that we had that went virtual in July and August. And we had more than 250 participants from 150 organizations. We broke the conversations into 3 panels that really set the stage in what are our science gaps, what are our needs and issues in the US, in Mexico and Canada, and with our indigenous communities. What initiatives and policy do we think are creative and needed for this landscape? After we did all that level setting, then we got into working groups around the 3 themes of partnerships and engagement, research and evaluation, and policy and funding. We wanted to make sure that we weren't just working kind of at that mid-level, that we had our leaders also hearing and contributing to the conversation. So they reacted to some of the priorities that came out of those initial work sessions. In the end, then we had 150 pages of notes that we condensed to 4 pages to really get at that 30,000 foot level. And we got there at the end of 2021. End of 2020. Now we're working on getting more regional and state input to better inform application on the ground. Next slide. So there was 12 priorities that were really elevated from this effort. So we kind of grouped those into 4 big buckets, and that comes down to elevating and supporting local initiatives and collaboratives, wanting to catalyze pilot efforts that can inform future farm bill or ag policy, and making sure that we're getting conservation on the ground and we're doing it at more of a community level, and addressing those needs that are relevant at the community level. Because as you know, as you move across communities, challenges and needs change. We also want to be thinking about land trusts and landowner cooperatives and grazing coalitions and tribal and federal lands and how they're part of the greater solution together. And when we think about working in different landscapes, how are we thinking beyond the initial border of that ranch or that Forest Service unit? And how are we ultimately scaling up and connecting the efforts across the landscape? We also wanted to make sure we're giving input to the North American Grasslands Act that the National Wildlife Federation has been championing, so that it's relevant and has the voices from the Western landscapes, and also trying to elevate Recovering America's Wildlife Act and what that can do for our West. Addressing limitations and needs in the Farm Bill, from economic incentives to resilient landscapes, to making sure that our policies are actually helping keep grass side up. And then a big need, what was elevated, was communications and messaging. Why are grasslands important? What do they mean to people? Do they even understand that they live in a grassland landscape? And then just connecting people to each other through trainings and information exchange, getting larger data on grasslands and wildlife and people together to tell the story through multiple lenses. And then Many people have stressed the need for opportunities to engage and learn from each other, to build trust and relationships, whether that's with a landowner or starting conversations with an Indigenous representatives. Next slide. So working groups.
Sorry, just to interrupt. This is John here. I think the slides have stopped sharing, Ian. Maybe if Christian could do it if it's not working for you, Ian. Sorry, Tammy.
Yeah, I can do it. Tammy, which slide are you on? I just temporarily lost track of that there.
I'm on the 30,000 foot level to the grassroots level.
Okay. Okay, go ahead, Tammy.
Okay, so as I talked about these different levels, because we had COVID, we had another year to really start looking more at the local level and capturing not just the top-down information, but the bottom-up. So we've been working at regional and state levels to get more information. We've been working on the Great Plains framework that NRCS has put out in the JV8 and making sure that the work is nested, scalable, and relevant on the ground. We're having intentional conversations with state wildlife agencies and the Natural Resources Conservation Service, to landowners and Indigenous leaders. We've given talks to the South Dakota Grasslands Coalition, Ranchers Stewardship Alliance, Missouri Conservation District, and we also put together a collaborative survey that we put out to landowners through partners across the 10 Central Flyway states. We also have a landowner advisory group to help inform our efforts. And we want to make sure that we're capturing the biggest barriers as well as the biggest innovative ideas. Next slide, Christian.
Yep.
So the survey intent is to ensure that priorities identified in the roadmap support ranchers, landowners, producers. This was focused on landowners. We want to look at what they're experiencing with programs that are out there, brainstorming on future programs, and priority communications messaging. We were able to get 153 respondents over a 3-month period. So here's just some quick results from that. So landowner survey results, the survey, did you go to the next slide?
Yeah, I've got your what will ranchers keep ranching.
Okay. Okay, let's go one more slide. So important metrics, economics. Landowners obviously really care about economics that matter, annual yield, net profit. They also care about ecosystem measures, including bird populations. They're hearing from us, they understand that these populations are in decline and ways that they can help with these rates. Carbon sequestration, biodiversity, soil health. And then rangeland and operation metrics, including resiliency, breeding, calving success, and livestock health. Next slide. Future programs that folks wanted to see include ecosystems and topsoil improvement and conservation, proactive management, carbon sequestration, and also programs for small producers. There's also a big interest in education programs for producers on sustainable management. And then they really feel the general public, our urban audiences, they are not connected. And how can we get more information out there about healthy grasslands, sustainable grazing management, and how these things go together in terms of conservation? The complete report is posted on the website, www.grasslandsroadmap.org. Next slide.
Yep.
So the next thing that as we move forward towards the summit that now we're going to try to reconvene in May of 2022, again, top and local. So we want to ensure that we're thinking about the 3 countries. So at the trilateral in May last year, grasslands were elevated across all the different tables, and they committed to doing a letter of intent that they'll sign in May of 2022. So Christian and I just visited about making sure there's momentum there and visiting with partners in Canada to help shepherd that along, while also doing that in the US and Mexico. Then in the US, working on memorandums of understanding for federal partners to elevate grasslands as a priority across our country. Our ideal is shooting for signing at the Department of Interior, Department of Ag, and Department of Defense levels. A lot of us are looking at the 30 by 30, the Biden administration now, the America the Beautiful policy, and how we achieve this in a privately dominated landscape. We want to elevate voices and messaging from landowners to NGOs, focusing on what we all agree upon: importance of the Farm Bill, joint ventures, indigenous rights, keeping grass side up. We also need to help temper that a lot of people are seeing this as a land grab, and how do we reiterate and make it in a working landscape context, recognizing that our issues cross countries. Birds are wildlife, they don't stop at borders. The North American Grasslands Act and getting other organizations to consider endorsing it, speaking up about, they now are broadening it to grasslands and sagebrush, and they also have specific funds for Indigenous communities. And Canada is making a lot of great progress with Indigenous engagement, the 30 by 30. We need to broaden our Western ways. I've been listening to different seminars and different voices about accepting Indigenous knowledge, values, culture. There's different barriers that we need to be addressing. We need to build relationships and trust and voices. And we need to look at respect, equity, and empowerment. And we need to blend conservation and Indigenous culture. We're all on the same page and planet. Together, we're going to do this right. And then work groups in Canada and Mexico have formed to help take the roadmap and think about what unique things they need to do, from policy to delivery to science, in their countries. And I'll turn it over to Christian to share a little bit more about Canada.
Yeah, so thanks so much, Tammy. And I'm having a good time keeping up with you here. So we formed a little working group in Canada. There's been a lot of Canadian participants in the virtual summit, and we're really hoping actually to increase that even more in the in-person summit next year. I think for me in particular, what I see my main job as is to really elevate grasslands as an ecosystem and their urgency of the conservation of that ecosystem. So, and obviously working with the federal government, I'm trying to do that internally up through our leadership chain, which is very difficult. We live in a very siloed world as well, and everything about this needs to be interdisciplinary. And that means working with agriculture and all sorts of other different departments. And that's getting the message across to leadership of that. So for me, the Grassland Summit has been a wonderful opportunity to throw international attention on this. I think it's very timely. Some of you who have heard my talks on grasslands in the past might think of them as often very pessimistic and dire and how much we're losing. But lately they've been very optimistic because there is so much going on in grasslands, and I think this is a chance to really turn the ship around. So in the interests of making this a living, breathing, continuing, and keeping Canada engaged in the summit process, and I want to stress the word process there, it's not an event, but an ongoing thing. We formed a Canada working group. We meet monthly. There are other working groups that Tammy has been mentioned, so we're just one of many, but we've had some success, I think, in really gathering together quite a ragamuffin group of just about everybody. We have great First Nations engagement in this, all sorts of different industry and local group interest, government, provincial government, federal government, etc. And I'm quite happy that we're meeting monthly to discuss how to make all this a reality in Canada. We've even been able to find a little bit of money. I found some money internally. For example, we just began a contract with CIER, that's C-I-E-R, which stands for the Center for Indigenous Environmental Resources. And this contract is to increase First Nations engagement and gather First Nations perspective on grasslands. And we also have a communications contract out at the moment. There's a lot of the members of the Canada Working Group are particularly interested in communicating this with the bigger public and the importance of this. And, you know, ultimately the beauty of that is it brings pressure to bear on governments to act. So this is all going on. And as I mentioned, you know, everything about this type of approach, the working landscape approach, or whatever you prefer to call it, is interdisciplinary. So I'm really trying to use the working group as a way to work with other initiatives that are ongoing. And there's so many, so I really can't list them all. I have another PowerPoint that's about 50 slides long with all of the different ongoing initiatives. But trying to sort of get alignment between, for example, there's a lot going on in the ag sector. Priority sectors is one of the federal government initiatives, priority places as well. You've probably heard announcements about nature smart climate solutions and the big push to really, you know, look at the climate problem by the carbon sequestration mechanism. And I think many of you will know that grasslands and wetlands are a strong focus of the Nature Smart Climate Solutions Fund. There's, of course, species at risk recovery and all of those other teams. And for example, there's First Nations consultation under species at risk, which we are trying to partner with to find synergies with when we deliver some of our virtual gatherings with First Nations on this topic. And as I mentioned, many more. We've actually, the PHJV in particular, since this is a PHG webinar, I think has really been having, well, quite recently a 2-day symposium on, which includes, sorry, not symposium, meeting, which in which there was a large grassland session, a lot of healthy discussion around NAGCA, which Tammy mentioned, which is the North Americans Grassland Conservation Act, which is currently proposed, which is modeled on NACA, the North American Wetlands Conservation Act, that many of you will be familiar with, which we in Canada see as a wonderful opportunity to, well, firstly bring money north of the border, but also to sort of achieve some of what the waterfowl folks have managed to achieve by doing so, and by the focus on wetlands there. And for us, a similar focus on grasslands, we're hoping to achieve similar things. There's also other ongoing things. So I'm one of the experts on the CEC, the Commission for Environmental Cooperation Grassland Initiative, which I hope will be launched this year. It's sort of past its public consultation period now. And as a result of that, we've been able to get, you know, this summit and these type of initiatives mentioned within the CEC. So it's really a question of, there's a lot of people doing a lot of great stuff, and we are sort of trying to get everybody aware of each other and rowing in the same direction. And I will pass it back to you, Tammy.
Okay, so you need to advance through a couple of your slides.
Are you saying where are we headed? Where we are headed or not?
Yeah.
Okay.
All right. Great. Well, thank you, Christian. Really appreciate Christian's been an amazing leader and connector with Canada. So thank you again. So based on our 30-foot view, now again, we're looking at that more, what we want to advance. What are we going to do between now and May? So we're putting together a meeting in October 27th and 28th, to bring together scientists across the different sectors. As you're aware, grassland birds are in steep decline. But there's lots of different lists out there. There's the bird conservation, the BCC list of Fish and Wildlife Service. There's the Road to Recovery list. There's a Partners in Flight list. States have their species of greatest conservation need. So can we come together as a community and maybe identify our top 20 that really address those in greatest decline, that cover the different geographies and habitat needs, that people can also identify and relate to, and it brings multiple partners to the table. So we have representatives of songbirds, waterbirds, shorebirds, waterfowl, as well as some of our upland game birds that are in decline, including grouse and quail. We recognize that it'll be hard to get to consensus, but hopefully at least alignment, so that we can think about what birds we can keep common, what birds are in decline that we can help reverse, and which birds are in the steepest decline that hopefully we can get to stable. And then we hope to take that and then think about, well, how many acres is that going to take? Based on what we know, Is this 100 million acres? Is this 150 million acres? We'll be integrating with the JVs and their habitat objectives and population targets as part of this. And then we are also working collaboratively through the JV8 and the Grasslands Roadmap with Barry Robinson and the work he's done up in Canada, and trying to take those models and spreading them across the whole geography and bringing in the wintering grounds to the equation too. And then we want to make sure we have social science expertise at this meeting, because at the end of the day, as we move forward, it's going to take people working with people on the ground to change the trajectory and to change what these landscapes look like and how to make them more sustainable for people, for economics, and for wildlife. Next slide. So we also are having a Grassland Forum that we're pulling together. I don't know if a lot of you follow, but National Public Radio, there's been a lot of conversations about cattle, climate, and the future. So we want to add to that conversation, and we'll be partnering with Colorado State University and the Center for Collaborative Conservation, the Salazar Center, and the Denver Museum of Nature and Science. And our target's going to be urban, suburban audiences, mainly in Colorado, but we'll reach out to our neighboring states. And we really want to capture kind of a 4-part series. What are grasslands? Where are they across the world? What are challenges that they face? Why are they important to us? What are we seeing in terms of wildlife and human communities on our grasslands? We'll also likely highlight a case study for a great collaborative effort between the natural areas of the city of Fort Collins and Larimer County, the 50,000 acres that they've now conserved as permanent open space. But there's bison there. There's also black-footed ferret. There's a local grazing association. There's recreation. There's wildlife conservation. And that work is also leveraging investments in conservation in Mexico. So it's a great study to showcase. And then why these different organizations like Bird Conservancy and Audubon and World Wildlife Fund and others are working with landowners for conservation. This series will take place about the middle of February to the middle of March. And if you stay tuned to our website, you'll be able to tune into that when it's available. Next slide. Beyond the Grasslands Forum, you heard it in the big buckets, you heard it from what landowners said in their surveys. There is a disconnect. People don't understand grasslands. They see it as a wasteland. They don't even recognize that they live in a community that's surrounded by grasslands. So we want communities to look out their back doors. Here in Colorado, not just look west to the mountains, but look east, and the importance of them to their health and well-being. And because this is the policy group, I also wanted to say we do have a team that's working on sustainable grasslands policy. And again, as I mentioned, focusing on the 80% we agree upon and what we can elevate. And it's overall, we're coining it as towards a sustainable future for the Great Plains, looking at Indigenous voices and needs, succession planning, perverse incentives that actually encourage grass conversion, incorporating policy with nature-based climate action, dealing with rural economic and ecological health, and then also funding for what does work, like the joint ventures, the Fish and Wildlife Service NEOTRAP Act, elevating new opportunities like the North American Grasslands Conservation Act. And several partners are working on this, from the Nature Conservancy to Audubon to World Wildlife Fund, National Wildlife Federations, foundations, and landowners have been in there. And we also have Indigenous voices, and we're working on making sure this works for the diverse cultures in our communities. So next slide is, we're preparing for the summit in May of 2022. It'll be May 24th and 25th, I think, in Fort Collins. And this is where people talked about, we need time together. We need to build relationships together. We could do so much of that virtually, but you know, a handshake and an honest conversation with people matters. So we'll be setting the stage for this. We'll likely break into some country groups so we can have some conversations together there, then breaking into sectors and reacting to what are we shooting for, what are the measures, how do you contribute to those measures, what can you prioritize in the next 1 to 3 years, and then getting cross-sector conversations so that they're learning from each other and challenging each other and validating the measures, and then getting to formalizing the roadmap and measures of success and actually hopefully signing commitments. We want to stay in touch, so probably every couple years we'll glom onto the National Wildlife Federation, their Grasslands meeting that they have, and stay together and updating and working on any barriers or things we need to work on as we move this forward over the next 10 years. And then establishing a team to steward and carry the roadmap forward that honors the 8 sectors in 3 countries. Next slide. Just also, again, the joint ventures are a working model that's great out there, wanting to make sure we're elevating the JV8. We worked for several months on the map just to get the geography right. That includes the joint venture 8 boundaries. It includes the Commission for Environmental Cooperation boundaries, as well as the Partners in Flight bird conservation region boundaries. And we also have strong integration with the JVs and the JV8 coordinator. And again, it's an opportunity for JV's voices to inform the roadmap effort, leverage the partnerships across the 8 sectors, and ultimately increase engagement, collaboration, and investments across the geography. Next slide. And just also trying to get, the reason for the foundations group is, look, you are investing in a lot of different disparate efforts. How do you leverage that? How do you, if we can have these priorities, can you make those aligned with your priorities for this region and really help move those forwards? Joint ventures are a great opportunity for investment. So where corporations align, they could invest and leverage the federal dollars they get with non-federal dollars. As we know, non-federal dollars are gold these days. Foundations catalyzing across borders and boundaries and complementing efforts. And then NIFWIF, and they have a great model, federal, corporate, private dollars. How are they part of the equation? They now have the Northern Great Plains model and the Southern Great Plains. So their geography has expanded, which is a critical key part of this effort. The AFWA, the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies, this effort actually started as a national conservation need from states. So now that we've got this effort going and the roadmap is happening, how do we then help use that as a resource for funding to now implement the roadmap? And then just thinking about cross-boundary funding, and then the investment literally has to move from millions to billions to really make the changes that we need in our landscapes. So next slide is just where we're headed, again, on measures and commitment. As we look to validate the birds, there'll also be other efforts with pollinators and hopefully mammals, but do these acres make sense? Can they change the trajectory? And now how does industry commit to helping reach those acre goals, and federal and NGO and landowners and JV partners? And can we get to that stable population for grassland birds in the greatest declines, but also making sure that pollinators, pronghorn, black-footed ferret, prairie dogs are also contributing and moving in the right direction on the landscape as well. Next slide. And then we're also honing in on water land metrics. Water matters to communities, it matters to people, it makes things happen. So is it keeping our aquifers at a certain sustainable level, keeping our water in our watersheds? Industry is really obviously committed to carbon and removing carbon. So they want to see a 30% reduction in the carbon out in this landscape in the next 10 years. How are they helping do that? We also need to be thinking about the stability of our human communities, measures that matter to people, and then grassland sustainability measures. And then next slide, this is just trying to show how this kind of all fits together. So we have the big goals and vision that happened during the virtual summit, then we get to these commitments, and then what are the mechanisms for tracking these commitments, and how do the different partners out there really help carry the ball and keep us accountable and keep us on track as we move forward. And then the scorecard again is that accountability piece. We want to make sure we move from just outputs to outcomes. This isn't meant to be a document that sits on a shelf. It's meant to be a living document that we work from, we actually are accountable to, and it's an iterative process, and we move it and change it as we continue to move forward. And then lastly, just everyone matters in this landscape. You can sign up for the newsletter and hear more about what we're up to. If you're interested in one of those working groups, we'd love to have your engagement and your expertise, and you can learn more through the www.grasslandsroadmap.org website, but you can also ask to join a working group or learn more through the facilitator, Matt Gray, at info@grasslandsroadmap.org. With that, I think that's the end of our slides, and be more than happy to take questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Tammy and Christian. I'm hearing a bit of echo of myself, so hopefully you're not also experiencing that. Tammy, feel free to turn your video on if you like. Yeah, and then we can go through here. I'll just say, well, yeah, thank you so much for all the work you're both doing and for presenting here today. We have some time for questions, and I'll just kick this off, and then, you know, being a bit of the flake that I am, I have to bow out and have a class in a few minutes with a midterm that I have to go proctor. So, so Ian will take over in his capable facilitating hands. So if there are questions, I think we have one from John Carlson. If I could just pop that, or a hand. John, why don't you go ahead and ask your question?
It's not as much of a question as just a statement based on some previous work on cross-border, and Tammy had mentioned the need for a federal match. And one of the things that we found in the past was that federal US dollars can be matched with federal Canadian dollars and not be considered federal dollars. So by combining federal dollars, we're meeting the match requirements on both sides, and that was very effective in building some funding capacity pretty quickly by doing that.
That's awesome, John. Thank you for sharing that. It's nice to know that federal dollars across countries can be leveraged.
Any other questions this morning? We don't want to let them off the hook too easily, so.
They're probably concerned if we can answer questions with all the technical difficulties I had. Sorry.
Oh, no. If I could ask a question, and perhaps it was covered a bit, but we hear about this initiative around a Grassland Act. How is the roadmap connecting? Could you maybe elaborate a little on that? And then how is the roadmap linking with that?
Yeah, so Aviva's been on the roadmap planning team since the beginning. And when we did the virtual summit last summer, the North American Grasslands Conservation Act was elevated as a priority need because it brought the three countries together. So what we've been doing is promoting the act through the newsletter and making sure that voices are being shared with Aviva so she can be incorporating Western concerns and values. And I know that they've adjusted some of the priorities in there, including adding sagebrush, including having a separate pot for Indigenous communities because of the feedback that they're receiving. And now I'm talking to her about the fact that if this gets passed, there'll be councils that will help determine how the funds are allocated across the geography, and seeing if the roadmap planning team, if someone on there can be part of the council so that connections continue and the priorities of the roadmap help inform how they invest in this central flyway geography.
Great, thank you. Yeah, we'll stay tuned on that because a lot of good initiatives happening.
Yeah. And the bill is actually being crafted. They expect it to be crafted over these next couple months. So if you haven't engaged, please do go to #ActForGrasslands and you can learn more. And they're actually trying to get more partners to sign up. So in that policy piece, John, we said, let's elevate getting more buy-in and partner support for the Act for Grasslands now, while we work on getting our voices together and then a strategy to bring that to our higher level folks in DC.
Great, thank you.
I'll quickly add, John, that you know, I saw a lot of interest in this at the PHJV level. Dean did his presentation on this, and there seems to be, well, basically there's a lot of lessons learned from NACA and all of that experience, and there's a pile of it. And so there's some, I think the joint venture voice to bring that forward is what we've learned, the First Steps program and things like that, how that got started, etc. So I expect that a lot of people will want to have input on this as it I think the first thing is because this is not this is a bipartisan or nonpartisan bill that's being put forward essentially by a group of NGOs. I think the first thing is really elevating it and sort of showing that we're interested in it, that we hope that it goes through, and we think it's got great promise.
Right. Thanks, Christian. Any last questions? Otherwise, I'll wrap us up here. Just as a final thought, so for those of you that are guests on this webinar too, this is the first of 4 that we're going to have dealing with grasslands because of this sort of momentum and initiative around grassland conservation and policy right now. So in November, we will hear from the Saskatchewan Prairie Conservation Forum, and in December from the Alberta Prairie Conservation Forum, and in January, we'll hear from the JV8 Grasslands Initiative. So I'd encourage you to join those webinars as well if you can. There's a lot of lessons from those historical organizations that have spent decades working on this. And so we want to ensure, the PHJV wants to ensure if we're delving into this that we're helping and not being redundant and doing the best we can. So, all right, well, thank you, Tammy, and thank you, Chris. Yeah.
John, there's a question here.
Oh, is there? Here you go.
What types of research are priority to support the initiative? Spatial targeting for habitat conservation or protection efforts, assessment of agriculture ranching practices and species responses?
So I'm going to try to, and then Christian, you can add to this, but in terms of research, so first we're just trying to get some integration of the data, better modeling and where these birds are and where important areas are. And then be thinking about acres and what acres do we need to be thinking of in terms of conservation easements and leasing, in terms of restoration, and in terms of conversion. So how do we take the core areas and make them larger? And how do we take opportunities like we're working in Montana? There are farmers that want to take their land and put it back to grass. So where we can put that on the landscape and then get the native seeds in there to help make that happen. And then doing that in areas that help connect to existing grasslands, so we get a bigger block effect. And then we do want to make sure, as we're working on this meeting October 27th and 28th, that we also elevate the things we don't know and we need to know. And that could be economics and social science, as well as what are the big triggers for some of these birds causing declines. But we also know that we can't wait to have all the answers, because the lost opportunity as the landscape continues to change, we want to make sure we can keep as big of a buffet table as possible of grasslands out there. So it's kind of this tension of conservation and moving forward, and as we learn more targeting and more spatial focus as well. And I don't know if you wanted to add more to that, Christian.
Yeah, that's super, Tammy, and a great question, Matt. I would just say that, for example, Barry Robinson would be the guy to talk to about some of this. So what Barry's done from the PHJV side of things is an analysis primarily on the primary prairie endemics, so that includes chestnut-coated longspur, thick-billed longspur, striped pipit, barred sparrow, which are confined to this geography, which in Canada under our act are species at risk. And so he's looked at their distribution, relative abundance, using some of the methods developed by the Boreal Avian Modeling team, then overlaid that with other analysis of land conversion, risk of land conversion, and other things. And Barry would be the one to talk to about all the things in that model. It's quite complicated. And then identified a spatially explicit priority target areas that are at high risk, but which maximize the conservation of those key species. And so Barry's been involved in what the metrics working group that Tammy mentioned, and there's others. For example, the Rainwater Basin has their joint venture has their priorities. Graham, I think, might be on the call, can talk about the JV8 and their target setting. So there's been sort of an attempt to align all of the above. And there's also simultaneously an attempt, by the way, to get grassland inventory. It's been particularly earth observation and inventory work aligned within Canada. Some great projects, for example, in Saskatchewan, also Manitoba. So we're trying to align them in Canada. Then there's an effort to align them with the United States and Mexico through the CEC, and others like the Burke Conservancy, the Rockies have done some very interesting Google engine work in the Mexican side of the piece. So we're trying to, in essence, get all of this to the point where it can be tied together for precisely that. But anyway, that's I'll put my email in the chat if you want to follow up on that, Matt, or you can reach out to Barry. And or of course Tammy, I don't want to put her on the spot, but for the bigger picture. Jump in, Graham.
Yeah, I was just going to jump in a little bit, and only really to endorse what you said. I mean, you know, collectively with, you know, with all of these initiatives, we were all shooting for the same kind of metrics on developing appropriate sort of direction on maximizing return on investment to get the best return on conservation targets, and I think we're making good progress there. I would only add, and just related to the question on research, I think, you know, with JV's emphasis on delivering on the ground conservation actions, you know, reducing further south outside of Canada, reducing brush encroachment and some of the other practical steps, there is still a research gap, I think, in terms of understanding the you know, the effects of fire, the effects of grazing, and you know, best methodologies for delivering some of these things we want to hit. And so, you know, that's not exactly innovative, but I think it's a gap. And in some ways, we're trying and testing methodologies without really the good metrics behind them. And that's, you know, if JV8 has a kind of a research kind of thrust, it's also in that area as to how we deliver better given limited resources.
I would say the last thing I was going to add is we're working on an integrated population model for Baird sparrow, so it does bring in the breeding, the wintering, and in between, and figure out where we're losing species. And then once we understand that better, is it a breeding ground? Is it a wintering ground? Is it a combination? And then what do we need to then do in those landscapes that are creating those limiting factors? And we're also talking to Barry about some of these grassland management strategies and bird population level responses, and how do we help inform those in a way that supports habitat heterogeneity and grassland bird diversity. So lots of good things coming. I see we lost John, so Ian, I don't know if there's any other questions or.
This looks like it's it. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank Tammy and Christian again for taking the time to deliver their wonderful presentation. I'd also like to let you know, if you do have questions after the presentation, feel free to forward them to John, and he can certainly get them to Christian and Tammy, and we certainly can follow up from there. Again, thank you everybody for attending today's webinar, and we look forward to seeing you in the November iteration of the PHJV webinar series. So thank you everyone for attending today, and have a great day. Thank you.
Thank you. Take care.